At this time, I would like to recognize Reverend Alexa Fraser of the Montgomery County Lynching Memorial Project. Reverend Alexa.
Hi, I'm Reverend Alexa Fraser, and I'm honored to be testifying here today on behalf of Montgomery County Lynching Memorial Project, which probably most of you have figured out we call MoCoLMP. I will mention that my home here in Rockville is about a half-mile away from the two lynching sites in Rockville. I'd like to start my testimony, as we do at all of our MoCoLMP events, asking you to name with me the 3 people we know to have been lynched in Montgomery County. Mr. George Peck.
Mr. George Peck.
Mr. John Diggs-Dorsey.
Mr. John Diggs-Dorsey.
Mr. Sidney Randolph.
Mr. Sidney Randolph.
Thank you for saying their names with me. MoCoLMP was formed in 2018, and our mission statement reads, "The Montgomery County Lynching Memorial Project seeks to educate and engage communities about our history and the legacy of slavery, racial violence, racial terror, lynching, and systemic racism by promoting truth, remembrance, reconciliation, and reckoning in Montgomery County." We are a grassroots organization and a designated community remembrance project of the Equal Justice Initiative, otherwise called EJI. Our goal with all of our work is to create a Montgomery County that is, this is outside of the mission statement, but I'm going to add, that our goal with all of our work is to create a Montgomery County that is fair and just for all people, our children, and our children's children. We see this as part of the work of reconciliation. Our work began with learning more about the history of these known lynchings. And we always say known lynchings because searching for additional lynchings is always something that we are working on. Thank you for that story about the home being burned. I'm certain our history team will look into that. Following the protocols of EJI, we built community relationships and partnerships in Poolesville, Rockville, and indeed countywide. As part of our reconciliation work, we hold conversations, lots of conversations on the difficult topics of race relations and lynching in our county. Using conversations as the basis, we build partnerships with churches, schools in Poolesville and Rockville. For instance, in Poolesville, we were initially greeted with reluctance and concern about opening old wounds. After multiple conversations over a period of years and significant involvement by a number of local volunteers and community groups, we are now well recognized and our work is highly valued in the community. Several of us here recently volunteered at Poolesville Day, which is a fabulous local event. And it was just glorious to see people coming up to us, both to explore what our table was about and what our work was about, and to acknowledge that they knew about our work. We then performed public and well-attended ritual soil ceremonies for each victim. And thank you for putting these here, whoever did. Perhaps that was Loretta. These ceremonies were attended by hundreds of people and youth, local pastors, and other leaders spoke. Spirituals were sung by church choirs and as a community, We filled jars with soil of the spot where the men were lynched. We delivered these soil jars, or matching ones, to the EJI Museum in Montgomery, Alabama. And I was just there a couple of weeks ago and awestruck to see all 3 of those jars represented, with close to 2,000 other jars collected nationwide on display there. After additional outreach and conversation, our next step was to install markers for these victims in their towns. Once again, these installations were done with deep intention, powerful rituals, had local community members and community leaders speaking. These markers are intended to ensure that these tragedies will always be remembered. It has been much too easy for our county to forget this history thus far. I think of the markers as a reminder to remember. We are grateful to the Maryland Lynching Memorial Project for their financial sponsorship, their contribution to the marker for Mr. Peck. Our partner, the Montgomery County Remembrance and Reconciliation Commission, they're going to speak in a second, took on the task of installing the markers for Mr. Diggs-Dorsey and Mr. Randolph on county property by the site where those 2 victims were abducted. More on that in a moment. And to the Human Rights Commission. I could go into great detail on these lynchings, and you have heard great detail. We're so thankful for the work of Sarah Headland at Montgomery County in helping flesh out these histories. Tony Cohen, whose name has been mentioned, who is a founding member of MoCoLMP, as well as being a local historian of incredible resourcefulness and wisdom. But in addition to sharing the overview of these atrocities, I want to share a single characteristic from which we can learn about each man's lynching. All 3 were charged with a crime and arrested. Each was then abducted from the sheriff or jail holding them, and without judicial process, murdered by hanging. All 3 lynchings involve accusations of brutality by the lynched man against white people, particularly white women. There was no justice, there was no process. These were public, brutal murders, and no lyncher was ever brought to trial for their actions in all 3 cases. All 3 lynchings were supposedly by parties unknown. And yet we know that all of these communities were small, intimate affairs where probably most people knew each other. So there is more to each story, and let me share that with you, working backwards in time. Mr. Sidney Randolph was an itinerant laborer passing through Maryland when he was arrested for attacking a white family and killing their child. There was no evidence linking him to the family or the crime. It only took 30 minutes for an inquest, not a trial, to return a verdict that Mr. Randolph was responsible for his child's death. In fact, we heard the list of people participating in that inquest earlier. Mr. Randolph was abducted from jail in order to be lynched. What I particularly want to call to your attention is a quote from the Washington Bee shared earlier. But I think that this is almost universally true, if not just in Maryland. Mr. W. Calvin Chase wrote, "The unwritten law of Maryland is that if a white person is killed and the murderer cannot be found, some Negro must hang for it." I invite you to let that sink in. Mr. John Diggs-Dorsey lived and worked in Darnestown. As you have heard, he was employed by a middle-aged couple, James and Lenny Shifley. When I think that's pronounced Shifley, excuse me. When Mr. Shifley was away, Mr. Diggs-Dorsey was accused of attacking Mrs. Shifley. Protesting his innocence till he was killed, he was delivered to jail, and later a lynch mob of 30 to 40 men broke him out of jail and ultimately killed him by hanging nearby. Pieces of the rope used to kill him were given to participants as souvenirs. Let that sink in. Mr. George Peck was accused of attacking a white girl. A doctor examined her afterwards and concluded she was somewhat bruised but otherwise unharmed. Mr. Peck was arrested and then seized by an angry white mob, abducted and lynched. Let me say, he was carted around the area and there was no 7-Eleven, right? He shows up at a shop at 11 p.m. Personally, I believe this was orchestrated. His body was initially left hanging as white parishioners in a nearby church entered their service. I'd like to say that members of that white congregation have been nothing but supportive of our work in this area. Indeed, the marker is adjacent to their property, and they have given us permission to access it through their property. They held our events on their property, so there is movement there. So, eventually his body was cut down and buried without ceremony in an unmarked grave. But then, in what can only be described as an act of bravery and solidarity, according to the Baltimore Sun, within days he was exhumed by colored people and buried in their churchyard. That the local black community claimed his body for churchyard burial suggests that he was considered one of their own, and maybe they understood the pattern of racially motivated terror this lynching was a part of. Think of that bravery and let it sink in. MoCoLMP is devoted to discovering and sharing the truth of our county's history. As Maya Angelou said, history, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again. As we at MoCoLMP move forward with our work of reconciliation, we decided to look back in history to document other facets of our county's story. In particular, we have projects underway to map where lynchings took place in Montgomery County and where markers acknowledging those horrific events have been placed since 2023. Map plantation sites and identify enslavers and those who were enslaved. As the work progresses, this project may also identify those who sought to escape bondage. We are seeking to map the 40 Black communities, historically Black communities in our county. We are seeking, it's a long-range project, to map the sites and markets that sold enslaved people and also locations where they were held, sometimes called pens. We know that many people were sold from the plantation on which they were enslaved in a sort of an incidental manner, and we are trying to figure out how to research and show those widely distributed sales. We plan to partner with local organizations in this mapping work. We're also working to document racial covenants. I'm so glad to see that that work is going on nearby my home in Rockville. Those racial covenants are related to property in the county, and we want to conduct oral histories of elders in the Black community who can shed light on their experiences in our county. We have long-term goals of identifying descendants of victims and perpetrators of the 3 known lynchings. Wasn't it wonderful to see Bobby Leg? We also plan to research other examples of racial violence and map them. Our slogan has long been remembrance is resistance. We believe that exploring the unfolding truth of Montgomery County's history, its painful legacy of racial terror, discrimination, and violence is not just important, but it is essential. We at MoCoLMP believe that we must explore, document, and educate ourselves and others about this deep, always painful history, because without learning and sharing the truth, there can be no reconciliation. I want to say that MoCoLMP is a living, growing thing. If you're interested in learning more, volunteering, MoCoLMP people, raise your hands. Come talk to us.